Good evening, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me all right. My name is Alex Wilson. I have the honour of chairing the Yes Berwickshire group, which is a group of local people, just like yourselves, who came together 14, 15 months ago and formed ourselves into a group of campaigners. And here we are tonight, 14 months, 15 months later, at our last independence debate. This is our 12th, actually. We started off back in January in Gordon on a cold winter's night. All of us never having done this before, a wee bit nervous, a wee bit apprehensive that we could actually carry this whole thing off. We've learnt a lot, and here we are tonight, as I say, in our final meeting. So I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening. This is obviously a yes debate and a yes meeting, but it's not just for yes people. We do not want a room full of yes people. We're wasting our time. We're really trying to encourage people who are perhaps undecided, unsure, or perhaps even looking to vote no at the moment. It's all about giving out information. It's all about allowing you, hopefully, to take part in the biggest conversation we'll ever have in our lives. And when you go to the ballot box on the 18th of September, to make that informed decision. Not out of fear, not out of misinformation, but that informed decision based on all the facts you can. Now, unfortunately, and this is not just a cheap political stunt by myself, you'll be aware we have sort of 37 national newspapers in the UK. Not one of them support our campaign. So the only way we can really get our message out is not through the broadcast media or the printed media. It's by doing this. It's by meeting people like yourselves in community halls in Berwickshire. And the great thing about this campaign is it's taking place around Scotland. I'm sure you've all seen it on Facebook and Twitter, whatever else. If nothing else comes out of this debate, this referendum that we've been on for the last year and a half, it's engaging people again in politics and getting them involved, and coming out on a rainy Friday night, getting away from the telly and coming to a hall to listen to us. So, thank you very much. It's really good for you to come out. The second thing I'd like to say is that in every debate we have, we invite the Better Together side to come along as well, because we do see the merit in having a two-sided debate. Unfortunately, they won't debate with us, and that's the truth. We don't make this up. I would rather have here tonight a couple of no people, a couple of yes people, a good old-fashioned hustings, and you can hear the facts from both sides, but they refuse to debate with us, so take that any way you want. For tonight, the format will be, I'll do a quick introduction as I'm doing now, then I'll introduce you to our speakers. Approximately 10 to 15 minutes for our speakers. We're going to have a little break for a cup of tea and a cup of coffee, and some excellent shortbread that's becoming legendary in its status. And if there's any don't knows or knows in the room, if you want it, this will turn you to yes, I guarantee it, the shortbread if nothing else, okay? But you're all very welcome for that. And then the main part of the evening from our perspective is the question and answers in the second part of the evening. It's not about us, it's about your good selves, to raise any questions that you may have, to ask any concerns. And with that in mind, could I please encourage you, if you haven't been asked already, there's a number of my colleagues walking about with these little sheets of paper. Fill them in, and in the second half of the evening, we'll go through them, we'll ask questions, and then if we can, we'd like to throw it open to the floor as well. So that's the sort of format for the night. Should be finished by about 9:30. That's how we tend to run these things. A couple of domestics. I think the ladies and gents' toilets are out on the right-hand side there. And in the event of a fire, there we go. Okay, we get out that way. A couple of just sort of minor things. We like to video these meetings for people that can't get there, and it's just to put that information out into the internet. So my colleague Marshall's here tonight again has been very kind enough to video a number of our recent debates. We like to get you involved as well in the Q&A, so one of my colleagues will be going around with a mic if you'd like to ask a question, so we can pick you up. If you don't want to be videoed, we won't video you, but unless we hear from you, we'll be happy just to video it. The video goes out as it happens. There's no editing, there's nothing else involved, so whatever comes about tonight will go out tonight. And I'm pleased to say as well, as some of you are probably aware, we've got less than 2 weeks to go. The world's eyes are upon us here in Scotland. I've been interviewed. I'm getting blasé now. I've had so many cameras put in my face in the last couple of weeks. We were in Eyemouth today, and we had a European news station interviewing us. And tonight, I'm very pleased to say we've got ITN Borders News as well here. Yeah, they were good enough to have a little chat with us last week and discovered we were here tonight, and asked if they could come along. Again, I think it's just important that they can capture a little bit of history, really, because this is not going to happen again. Really, one way, whatever happens, yes or no, this is not going to happen again. So we need to remember it, we need to cherish it, and we need to really enjoy it as much as we can. So that's me. Thank you very much for your attention. Our three speakers tonight, I'll just sort of quickly introduce them if I may. We have Councillor Joan Campbell, and some of you may know her. Joan lives in Chirnside, so very much a local person. We have Paul Wheelhouse, MSP, Cabinet Minister for the Environment. Paul lives in Ayton. Again, probably well known, I would think. And on my far left, Nigel Mace from Academics for Yes. So quite a range of speakers tonight, and really just giving you their perspective on why they'll be voting yes in September. So thank you for your time, and I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Joan Campbell. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. Hope you can hear me. Right. One Saturday, many years ago, my youngest son and I were up in Glasgow. And all of a sudden, some young people started to appear on the street carrying boxes. And they started handing out the latest biscuit bar that was going to come on the market. We unwrapped the bars that we'd been given, and we took a bite. And almost at the same moment, we said to each other, "They're not square." And of course, everybody knows squares aren't square. But we accept it, and it doesn't really matter that much. It gets our attention, we buy the product, it's just clever marketing. But let's compare that to an advert that appeared recently, The Woman Who Made Up Her Mind. The video showed a young woman alone in a kitchen, cup of tea in her hand, mulling over the fast approaching referendum polling day. She mentions her husband, her children, and her indecision. She says she wants the best for her children and for Scotland. And voila, she makes a decision. There's no discussion with her husband, her children, or anybody else. And she certainly doesn't appear to have done any research on the question being posed in the referendum. Now, along with many other people, I found this video condescending, patronising, and anti-feminist. To portray women as no more than a bunch of airheads is extraordinarily insulting. The suffragettes fought for the right of women to vote. And the women's liberation movement fought for women's equality in law and at work. They fought for the right for women to make decisions about and for themselves and to be treated fairly. This video certainly fails to treat women fairly, and it mocks the idea that women can make political choice based on knowledge and understanding of the issues. But unlike the naming of the biscuit bar, this flippant dismissiveness of Scotland's future in this advert does matter. The suggestion is that we should base our decision on emotive statements alone and not bother to look for information or discuss the issues. So let's have a look at the statements that helped the character in the video to come to her conclusion. She wants the best for her children and the best for Scotland. But there's nothing inherent in those statements that automatically lead to a particular answer, or indeed any answer. They're just statements. There's no supporting argument put forward to convince her audience that the best for Scotland, her children, or indeed anyone's children, lies with a no vote. It's just a leap from statement to to conclusion. It would seem that no thought process was involved in the making of this argument, or advert rather. So what prospects might be on offer for her children or grandchildren if Scotland remains in the UK? Well, when pressed recently during the second TV debate about to name free job creating powers which would be devolved to Scotland in the event of a no vote, Alistair Darling's only answer was the work programme. Now, I have difficulty in understanding how this would create jobs. The information about the work programme describes it as a programme which helps people into employment. But companies don't create jobs just to give people work. A company has to need that extra employee due to more orders or more contracts. Their current workforce has to be unable to fill the orders or service the contracts. And company expansion needs a growing economy and sustainable economic development. The work programme is run by contracted service provider companies, and incentive payments are made to them for the number of people who are helped by them into work. Reports on the efficiency of this scheme suggest that performance is poor and falls below the 33% target, but large bonuses are still being paid to these companies. Follow-up contact with employers is described as patchy. Under this scheme, young people are offered an opportunity to work, unpaid, with a company or charity for between 2 and 8 weeks, while still being paid job seekers allowance. Although the information says there may be a job at the end of this time, there are no guarantees. Previously, the scheme was less flexible, but this changed somewhat after the Westminster government was successfully sued by Kate Riley. She was forced to give up the voluntary work that she had secured for herself and which she hoped would lead to a permanent job in her chosen sector. Instead, she was forced to stack shelves in Poundland for 2 weeks, otherwise she would have lost her job seeker's allowance. Currently, the Scottish Government encourages companies to employ young people on a modern apprenticeship scheme. The young person is paid by the employer. The employer is given help between £1,500 and £2,000, depending on the circumstances of the young person employed. From experience, I know that the initial few months are a young apprentice's least productive time. I was actually self-employed as a partner in a company for 26 years. They have to start learning the job, understanding reasons for things such as health and safety, and how to fit into the workforce. It makes sense to spend directly on a young person in a more targeted way, rather than pay large performance bonuses to companies to simply place people in unpaid, short-term work experience situations which may not result in a job. But responsibility for employment and Job Centre Plus services are reserved powers, reserved to Westminster. The division of reserved and devolved powers means the Scottish Government cannot tackle the problems as effectively as it should. An independent Scotland would have all these powers and could build a more integrated system of education, training and skills development linked to employment services. This would not only serve our young people, but all people of working age much better than at present. And then, how do those who find paid employment fair? Analysis by the think tank Resolution Foundation reports that the gap between earnings of the younger and older age earners is widening. In the UK as a whole, 29% of young people are on low pay, compared to 16% of people aged 51 to 60. This means that many young people can't afford to buy their own homes. They have to rent. They are often in jobs that afford no security, no holiday pay, no sick pay, and limited hours. Resolution Foundation also found that 20% of all employees are earning below the living wage. The devolved Scottish Government can only pay the living wage to people in the public sector. They cannot raise the minimum wage for employees in the private sector. They can't raise it to the living wage level. That's a power also reserved to Westminster. Now, although I've concentrated on only one aspect of the possible futures for today's children in Scotland, I believe it's an important one. Most of their lives will be spent in employment, hopefully, and we need to be able to ensure our population can achieve their full potential. Education and training are key to this for individuals, but without the economic levers that independence will bring, Scotland will continue to struggle to create full employment for our people. Independence will allow us to choose our spending priorities. It will allow us to target help rather than spread it thinly. And it will allow us to grow our economy in ways that suits us best. For our future, for our children's future, and for the future of generations to come, vote yes on the 18th of September. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joan. Just before I introduce and pass you on to Paul Wheelhouse, one thing I forgot to mention is we have lots of information at the back of the room on the table. Please help yourselves. If there's anything you'd like to take away, you're more than welcome to. But if I could just, this is going down a storm at the moment. Some of you may be aware of it. It's called the Wee Blue Book. It's crowdfunded by us, the people of Scotland, and it's really a reflection or an answer to the issue that I alluded to at the start of the meeting, that, say, approximately 37 printed media titles in the UK, not one of them supporting the Yes story, shall we say. So the only way to circumnavigate that was to do it ourselves. So please, I do recommend it. If anyone's undecided still, anyone would like more information, these are excellent little pieces of reference, so please help yourselves. But anyway, other than that, I'd like to introduce and pass you on to Paul Wheelhouse.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Alex, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along tonight. As Alex says, this is a really important opportunity for us to discuss with you. I'm going to try and find the right point for the microphone so I don't end up spitting into it or whatever. Is it going off now? Swap over. I'll swap over. Plans of mice and so forth. Exactly. Thank you. This will be my final formal speech in this referendum campaign, so it's a special moment for me after having campaigned since 2003, for the chance to have this opportunity to decide our future, but obviously working with colleagues in the last 6 months to a year, we've had fantastic kind of almost personal growth in the process and making new friends along the way. But I'm delighted to be doing it in Chirnside, in the heart of Berwickshire, the county I call home. And on September the 18th, we have a unique place in history. We are, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, the only generation of Scots to have had a say in the future of our country and to take the chance, potentially, to put our future in our own hands. So we have a very special role in historical terms. It's not just a matter for today. This goes back hundreds of years, clearly since 1707. And for this union has long been one which perhaps could be characterised as being an unequal union between Scotland and England, and obviously Wales and Ireland. But since Ireland has seeing that the Irish Republic created, Northern Ireland is what remains. We have, at one point, Scotland was even styled North Britain, and there was a real risk that our identity as a nation would disappear altogether. The North British Hotel, Balmoral Hotel it's now called, was once a sign of that trend in almost people being ashamed of their Scottish heritage and putting aside being Scottish and talking about themselves as being North British. And to put this in perspective in terms of history and how far we have come, I just want to quote something from Robbie Burns, just over 200 years ago, when he wrote to one of his many lady friends, "What are all the boasted advantages which my country reaps from the union that can counterbalance the annihilation of her independence and even her very name?" Well, quite. But ladies and gentlemen, today's debate is not really about flags. It's not really about anthems. It's not really about identity. While that is a dimension to the debate, what it is about where power lies, whether that is in London or in Edinburgh, and about what kind of society and what kind of future we want to have as a country. So let's focus on that. We will decide on the 18th of September whether Scotland will be an independent country, just like other successful independent nations, like Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, other countries like Ireland, the many countries that have left the control of London over the time, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, United States itself. None of these countries, the ones that latter four have mentioned, have asked to come back under the control of London. So when we're told this is for good and there's no going back, well, fine. Nobody has ever asked to come back when they've had the opportunity we're hopefully about to seize. Alternatively, of course, if we vote no, we would remain in that unequal union. One in which 1 million Scots out of 5.3 million Scots in our population are below the poverty line. That, I find, an astonishing statistic, but just to put that in perspective, 120,000 children in Scotland live below the poverty line. Their families struggle to pay bills, and they struggle to heat their homes. In some cases, they even struggle to put food on the table. And I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but I am ashamed that in this modern era we have 48,000 Scots regularly relying on food banks for the food they eat, the very food they eat. And I heard, and I think many of us have probably heard the story about Mary Hill Food Bank, when a lady who had 2 children had been waiting from the Thursday of a previous week, came into the food bank on a Tuesday, not having eaten once in that period from Thursday to Tuesday, scrabbled around the floor to find a tin that she could open with her fingers, a ring pull tin, and started swallowing baked beans there and then in the food bank. That is 21st century Britain. That is the UK today. The UK is not okay in my book. We know that a further £25 billion worth of austerity cuts are coming our way, courtesy of a statement by George Osborne, regardless of who is in power, because we know Rachel Reeves, the Labour shadow spokesperson for the same portfolio, has said they too will implement an austerity agenda should they gain power in 2015. We know that the IFS, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, say that if these cuts are put through, at least another 100,000, possibly 120,000 children will find themselves in poverty, below the poverty line, by 2020. So we know what's coming down the line. But there is another way. Independence is a different future, taking our future in our hands, because we believe nobody better understands Scotland, nobody cares more about Scotland, and therefore nobody can make the best decisions for Scotland more than the people who live here and work here and care about our country. And that means having a parliament in Edinburgh that decides all of the key decisions that affect the people of Scotland, not a remote parliament in London that frankly sometimes appears not to give 2 hoots about the future of the people of Scotland. Ladies and gentlemen, no serious commentator now questions whether Scotland could be a successful independent nation. Even Alistair Darling has now gone on camera to admit this, after having been embarrassed by the words of David Cameron himself. And I just want to quote you what David Cameron, the UK Prime Minister, not known to be a cheerleader for independence, has said. Supporters of independence will always be able to cite examples of small, independent and thriving economies across Europe, such as Finland, Switzerland and Norway. It would be wrong to suggest that Scotland could not be another such successful independent country. The Financial Times states an independent Scotland could expect to start life with healthier state finances than the rest of the UK and be in the 20 wealthiest countries globally. Within the rich club of the world's 34 industrialised nations, Scotland, on paper, would be the 14th wealthiest country. The UK itself would be the 18th wealthiest country. So let us have no doubt about whether Scotland can afford to be independent. And this should not surprise us, and yet it does, because we have been told for generations that we're not up to the job. The single most frequent comment people have made to me over the last 7 years is, but can Scotland afford to be independent, Paul? And of course it can. Well, in fact, Scots have paid more tax per head to the UK Treasury each and every year since 1981. It could well be longer than that, but we only have figures that start in 1981. But every year that series has been produced, Scotland has paid more per head of population to the UK Treasury than the UK average. So let us kill once and for all the sentiment that Scotland is subsidised by the rest of the UK. Far from it. We paid in the last year for which there are figures, £53 billion in tax to the UK Treasury. That's £10,000 for every man, woman and child in the country. That compares with £9,200 for the UK. So that gives you a sense of scale. We are a wealthy country on paper. The problem is the people that we meet on the street, people we meet when we knock the doors, do not feel wealthy. That's why they find it so easy to believe that we're being subsidised by England and the rest of the UK. The Treasury each year gives us around 60% of the money we give them back as our pocket money, and then says, go on, run everything in Scotland in terms of the health service, public services, the government, police, fire services from within that 60%. They pocket the rest and spend on services that are reserved to Westminster. You know, in some cases they do things that we agree with, but in many other areas, including spending a ridiculous £100 billion potentially on replacing an immoral system of weapons of mass destruction parked 30 miles from our largest population centre, we would like to say no. The people of Scotland time and again have demonstrated they want to say no. The MPs from all parties in the Parliament, apart from the Conservatives, consistently said they didn't want Trident in Scotland. Yet what do we have? The entire UK arsenal of weapons of mass destruction outside our biggest city and posing a risk to our public health. We're a country that's in many ways has been powered by nature. We have immense natural resources. Scotland has 25% of the EU's wind energy and also tidal energy potential, and 10% of its wave potential. We have, at the moment, 60% of the EU's entire oil and gas reserves. I think Nigel's going to talk more about that, so I'll not go into that in too much detail. But we have great strength in financial services, tourism, food and drink, life sciences, our universities. We have 90% of the UK's fresh water. Think about that, 90% of the UK's fresh water in Scotland. We curse the rain, but believe me, that is a valuable resource. We have some 60% of the UK's sea fishery and around 12% of its agriculture for only 8.5% of the UK's population. We are a wealthy country, and credit rating agency Standard & Poor's have cited that even in the absence of oil and gas, which is a false scenario to paint because we know legally we would have that oil and gas, we would still qualify for what they say their highest economic assessment. What that means is, in practice, if we have a government that isn't running the country like a basket case, as long as we've got a sensible government and we, the people of Scotland, don't elect a silly government, we will qualify for a treble A credit rating, the top rating you can get for any government in terms of its borrowing. So it keeps our interest rates down. We have a sound economy, ladies and gentlemen. We have good public finances when compared with the UK as a whole. And let's focus on another Project Fear, because that's what they call themselves, classic, and talk about Europe, or specifically our EU membership. Scotland's future sets out that Scotland, that's the government white paper, sets out that Scotland shall remain part of the EU after a yes vote. A Team Scotland, when it's appointed, and it will not just be the SNP, it will be all parties, people will be picked based on talent to negotiate for Scotland in the event of a yes vote, will include individuals from right across the spectrum. Alistair Darling, the leader of the Better Together campaign, has even been invited to join that team. I'm not necessarily sure of that decision, but he has been invited by the First Minister. So we have put aside party differences, and we're saying, in the event of a yes vote, let's work together, get the best deal for Scotland and negotiate for Scotland. But that team will negotiate the terms of our continued membership. We never leave the EU after we vote yes. We're still in the UK until March 2016 when we become independent, and we're negotiating in that period between September this year and March 2016 our continued membership of the EU. Why is that important? Because we don't lose any of the rights and privileges of being a part of the EU while we're doing that. Our farmers continue to get to be paid as they are currently, single farm payments on a continuous basis, and we're able to establish our own terms and conditions of joining the EU at that point. Even Professor James Crawford, the man appointed as the UK government's advisor specifically to knock our plans, admitted that the timescale for that process was realistic. So we have allowed enough time, despite what you're told. And remember East Germany, when it reunified with West Germany, people said it would take years. It would take years, it would be out in the cold for a long time. It took 6 months to bring East Germany into the European Union. The EU is an expansionist organisation. It adds members. It makes it very difficult for people to leave the EU. And if you look at your passport, if you have one, it says you're a citizen of the European Union. There's no legal provision at all to remove your citizenship from the European Union. So we can regard that as being a safe bet. On currency options, the white paper sets out that we do not intend to join the euro, but instead stick with sterling and the Fiscal Commission Working Group, which is a team set up by the First Minister, involving two of the most prominent and eminent economists in the world, Professor Joseph Stiglitz and Sir James Mirrlees, the latter the academic tutor to the Governor of the Bank of England in post at the moment, has pointed to why a formal sterling currency union is the optimal arrangement both for ourselves in Scotland as an independent country and the rest of the UK. If the UK is determined to vandalise its own economy by refusing to share the assets of the nationalised, remember it's nationalised in 1946, you, me, everyone in this room has effectively a shareholding in the Bank of England. If the UK government decides not to share that asset that we all own with the people of Scotland and all of the debt it holds, the reserves it holds, the foreign currency gold reserves, then we can quite rightly say that we're not going to pay the debt associated with the asset you're not allowing us to have. So we can say to the UK government that is not fair, and we can still run with sterling anyway, but without the formal currency union. And I hope we get a chance to talk about that in more detail. But be clear, we are offering, and the unionists try and present us not doing this, we are offering to share the UK debt when we become an independent country. We think that's the responsible thing to do. So we're not the ones who are threatening to walk away from the debt. It's only if the UK government refuse to play ball and to have a formal currency union that situation could even arise. We don't need the permission to use the pound anyway, and I think recognition is finally dawning in both the financial markets and indeed the UK government and the Better Together campaign that this is the reality. And in the last First Minister debate versus Alistair Darling, those of you who've watched it will have seen Alistair Darling concede when being prompted by Joan Campbell, the BBC presenter, that of course Scotland can use the pound anyway. They know that. There's no currency controls. You cannot stop anybody using the pound. And for the record, the Isle of Man, the Channel Islands, the Isle of Guernsey and Jersey and Isle of Man and Gibraltar all use the pound. None of them are in the UK. Ireland used the pound when it became independent for some time before it developed its own currency and then joined the euro very latterly. For my part, I see clear advantages and clear benefits for Scotland being an independent member state of the EU. Not only could we benefit financially from that, with many funding streams available, but Scotland can follow the recent example of Ireland in taking our turn in the presidency and actually influencing the agenda in Europe. Europe is comprised of successful small independent countries, yet while many of these countries see a decent share of funding coming their way, Scotland is often languishing at the bottom of the league table thanks to the UK's abilities in terms of negotiation. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, who's not yet taken position but will do so later this month, his spokesperson has made clear he is sympathetic to Scotland and regards our situation as, I quote, a special case, and, I quote, would not want Scotland to be kept out. So we've had a change in personnel at the European Commission. Barroso, who you may have heard about, the Portuguese gentleman, has now gone. We now have the former Premier of Luxembourg, another small EU member state, who is very sympathetic to our case and will presumably provide a supportive analysis. And that's why that particular scare story didn't feature, if you watch both debates between Alistair Darling and the First Minister. Neither of them featured the EU membership story, despite it being headline news many months ago. It's largely been killed as an issue. It's no longer a valid scare story. On the Common Agricultural Policy, I hope we come on to that later. Suffice to say, Scotland is in a position, as I say, at the bottom of both the direct payments to farmers league table and the rural development league table, which funds everything from rural diversification, new job creation in rural areas, new tourism investment and agri-environment projects. And both these, Scotland languishes at the very foot of the table. And to put things in perspective, we get 48% of the average payment for farmers, and we get only €12 per hectare for rural development funding, but the average is 76. Ireland, just to kill the myth that big countries negotiate better deals for Scotland, like UK does a good job negotiating for Scotland. Ireland has the same area of agricultural land as Scotland. They've managed to draw down rural development funding, which is equivalent to 85% of the allocation to the whole of the UK. So they have 5 times as much as Scotland. So that's a small independent country setting out its priorities in negotiations and CAP and getting a far better deal, whereas the UK chose specifically not to argue for more money for Scotland, despite knowing we had the worst funding anywhere in Europe. So, there's much at stake in terms of farmers, and I'm sure we can come more onto that later on. But another comparison is Finland. Finland has 17%, we have 17% of the funding of Finland, the population the same size as Scotland. So Ireland's by no means the only example. Why it's important, we reckon that we could get almost 4 times the amount of money going through the economy and rural development. That's 4 times the amount of money going through rural economies like the Scottish borders to fund jobs, to fund diversification of businesses, to maybe have farmers moving into processing their produce and adding more value and selling direct to market. These kind of things are funded through rural development funding. Some village halls have been funded through it, some tourism projects, things like new pathways which contribute to tourism, many other investments. But as I say, Scotland clearly hasn't benefited from being part of this big state. And when it comes to the votes in the European meetings, I attend Environment Council meetings for Scotland as the Scottish Minister. I'm not allowed to speak. Even when the UK has a radically different position from Scotland, I can't speak. I sit behind the UK Minister. I have to just toe the line and smile nicely and not look too upset when he's arguing something diametrically opposed to us. We had a recent, I don't know what your position is on GM products, but Scotland has a position against GM products and the UK government is more pro-GM products. And recently at a meeting in Europe, the UK government, having promised to the Welsh and to ourselves that they would argue the case that devolved administrations within member states should have the ability to ban GM within their areas. Having made that promise, that was a red line for us in negotiations. You must put this in, Owen Patterson, please. When he went into negotiations, he forgot to mention it at all. And we had the embarrassment of having to point out to his officials and saying, oh, he used the wrong speech. He actually told me in that meeting that he had decided not to say it, and then subsequently told our committee of the Parliament he'd forgotten to say it. So I'll leave you with that one. We have the talents and skills as a country to succeed. Many do succeed despite the system. What we lack is the political and economic framework to maximise the chances of success and ensure Scotland's resources benefit sectors and Scotland's people. With the red meat levy issue being another one where we end up paying, because so many animals are slaughtered outside of Scotland now, the money that should have gone to promote Scotch beef and Scotch lamb is kept in England because the animals are slaughtered there. It's just manifestly unfair. The No campaign's approach is pretty negative, dreary, I would say, in terms of its campaign. And there are many, such as their deputy leader, Jackson Carlaw, who expressed embarrassment over silly state scare stories about the border controls. And US President F.D. Roosevelt, bearing in mind they call this campaign, called themselves internally, it was revealed by Tom Gordon, a journalist at the Herald, revealed that they called themselves Project Fear in private. US President Roosevelt said, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, and that was in the context of the great economic downturn in the 30s, but it's very pertinent here. Their tactics are to scare us into submission in some respects. You know, we do regard it as being a fundamental truth that the best decisions are made by people in Scotland. But a yes vote is not a vote for my party, it's not a vote for Alex Salmond as First Minister, you will have your chance in May 2016, just a mere couple of months after we become independent, to boot us out of office if you don't like us. So please let's not make the debate about Alex Salmond, whether you like him or loathe him. Personally, I have great respect for the man, and you'd expect that, but he has at least given us this opportunity. But it's really not about him. It's about your future and taking that future in your hands, deciding for yourselves what is the best for the people of Scotland. You can choose the government you want at that time, and that may be a completely different government. There may be completely different parties in that new Parliament. I think it's an exciting opportunity for Scottish politics to break the link with Westminster and determine the kind of parties and policies that the people of Scotland need and want. A no vote leaves Scotland vulnerable to future failures of Westminster governments. We don't vote for. We have only had a period of 23 months since the Second World War where our votes changed the outcome of a UK general election. In the 60s, and again most latterly in 1974, between February and October, those are the only occasions when we've had an impact of that kind. We tend to get Labour governments when the rest of the UK votes Labour. We tend to get Conservative governments when the rest of the UK votes Conservative. We possibly might get a UKIP government if the rest of the UK votes UKIP. And personally, that's not an appealing prospect for me. We have the risk of further Westminster imposed funding pressure on the NHS and key services, and that increases inequality. With a yes vote, we will rid Scotland, as I say, of the obscenity of Europe's largest arsenal of weapons of mass destruction, just within 30 miles of our largest population centre. More than 200 nuclear warheads based at Coolport and Faslane. That is wrong. Voting yes will allow us to invest, as has been said by Joan, in skills and employment for young people, but also childcare, where we've made specific proposals. Those are proposals of one party, and other parties in the Yes campaign may have a different view, but it's just to show the potential of how we could use the powers, irrespective of whether you think it's a good idea or not. The principle is we can invest in something like childcare, now under devolution, and the benefits of that in terms of putting people back into work and making their employ them and contribute more tax to the Treasury will go to the UK Treasury, and they will not allocate that extra windfall back to Scotland. That's not how it works. George Osborne isn't going to wake up and say, I've got a few hundred extra million in the tank and I'm going to give that all to Scotland out of his largesse. Where if we're independent and we invest in something like childcare and create opportunities for people to go back to work and they start contributing more to the tax base, that goes to a Scottish Treasury, so it becomes self-financing, and it makes sense to then have more adventurous, more expansive policies because we know we can pay for them through the taxes we generate as a result of that kind of investment. I believe with all my heart that Scotland can and should and indeed must be an independent country. I certainly urge you to vote yes to give us the powers we need for our economy to flourish. Through boosting investment in industry, in infrastructure, which is very important in this region, and the opportunities to promote exports in sectors like textiles and seafood. Nelson Mandela once said, "May your choices reflect your hopes, not your fears." Think about that. I very much believe that an exciting future awaits us in an independent Scotland, given our stronger public finances, as I say, the opportunity to tailor policies to our distinctive needs, as Joan has alluded to. When Scotland resumes her place on the world stage, we'll be a force for peace. We can be a force for international action in areas such as climate change. We can enshrine our values and the rights of individuals in a written constitution, something the UK is a very rare beast these days. It doesn't have a written constitution and they have no intention of creating one. Scotland can put that right. We can build a better country, one we all know Scotland can and should be. In conclusion, the great US President Abraham Lincoln said, "The best way to predict your future is to create it." How true. So let's heed those words and let's shape events and not be blown off course by them. So I say to you all, for the 15 hours, and this is a point that Jim Cllr has made very powerfully, for the 15 hours on the 18th of September this year, we, the people of Scotland, will be entirely sovereign for that period. If we have the confidence in ourselves, if we have the confidence in our communities, if we have the confidence in our country, Scotland, we will exercise that rare and precious sovereignty and vote yes for Scotland. And just finally, just to say, after all, remember, great things begin with a yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Great. We'll just move on, and I'd like to introduce our final speaker for the evening before we have our cup of tea and a bit of shortbread. Introduce Nigel Mace, and Nigel's representing academics for Yes this evening. Thank you.
Can you hear me at the back?
Aye.
Okay, right. Good evening, everyone. This is the 5th occasion on which I've had the extraordinary privilege of talking to my fellow Scots about this decision we have to make on the 18th. And I have to say, out of all the thousands of lectures I've given in my life, nothing has mattered to me more than these 5 occasions. I want to do 2 things. I want to begin by talking about 2 things which a no vote will not achieve, and then I want to give you my 4 principal reasons why I will be voting yes. So let me begin with a personal story. It takes me back to 1967, not because of the Hamilton by-election, nothing to do with politics. It just happened to be the first occasion that I went to the United States of America. And I was going there to be part of a conference on new ideas and reform in higher education. I went there full of my own bright ideas about changes in higher education, but also with an intense pride in the United Kingdom's system of higher education. Publicly funded, independently administered, and available to all who could make use of it, even to the extent of government grants. I also went with a great pride in the United Kingdom's welfare state, and especially its National Health Service. Through the generosity of my hosts, I travelled from Cleveland, Ohio, to universities in Southern Illinois, Chicago, Boston, MIT, Harvard, and New York. And when I returned, impressed though I was with these remarkable institutions, my pride in the United Kingdom's system of higher education and its welfare state was even more deeply entrenched by my experience in America. I have not lost my fealty to those values in the years since then. But the United Kingdom, I'm sad to say, has. And when I make my vote for yes on the 18th, I will not be leaving the United Kingdom, for it has been leaving me for a very long time. And there is no way that a no vote will bring back to life the United Kingdom of which it was once possible to be so proud. The second thing that a no vote will not do is it will not result in a single additional power or enhancement of status for the Holyrood Parliament. Now, I say this confidently because I know it, and actually, if you think about it, all of you know it. The parties who are at the moment making various vague promises, semi-offers, conditional pledges, are exactly the same parties who, by their carefully managed disagreements, made sure that there was no Devo anything on our ballot paper on the 18th. Why? Because they knew that if there had been, all the polls said that a Devo something option would have won easily. And if that had happened, these parties who had themselves been in government and who had failed to do anything would have been forced to introduce the legislation which they had never done when they had the power to do it. The fact that they didn't do it when they could, and they would not ask us our opinion when they could ask us, tells us that they will not do it now. Do not believe them. There is nothing comes from a no vote except nothing, or perhaps something worse. Let me turn now to my reasons for voting yes. And they begin with what I will call the real democratic deficit. And I'm delighted to see that Professor Tom Devine obviously shares very much my reasoning on this. From 1945 through the 40s, 50s, and well into the 60s, we were living in what historians call the post-war consensus. A broad common ground about politics in Britain, a mixed economy, a large public sector dealing with services and utilities, a healthy private sector, and the whole undergirded by a welfare state in which the National Health Service and the principle of universality ran like a golden thread. In those days, it was perfectly possible to say that a vote in Chirnside or Eyemouth or Innerleithen, where I am at the moment, or Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham, or the West Country, where I spent most of my professional life, that all these votes were the same. It was a common polity. But that is no longer the case. You know, we've had a remarkable experience since 1999. We've been able to watch in Holyrood, in embryo, what an independent Scottish government might be like. We've had a Labour administration, a Labour Liberal administration, a minority nationalist administration, and now a majority nationalist government. And all of them have trended in broadly the same direction. Social democratic, progressive in matters of society and welfare. And what has happened in Westminster? It has gone in directly the opposite direction. Let's just take the example of the National Health Service. There always were two, a Scottish National Health Service and an English one. The English National Health Service no longer exists in the form in which it was originally conceived. It has been fragmented, privatised, commercialised. The Secretary of State for Health no longer has to answer to the House for the provision of a genuine national service across the country as a whole. That is effected by some rather clever wording in the first clause of the 2012 Act. In Scotland, since 1999, exactly the opposite has happened. The marketisation reform, so-called, introduced by Mr. Blair, have been turned away from, and the Scottish National Health Service has gone back to the principles on which the National Health Service was originally founded. A public service, publicly owned, and overwhelmingly public in its provision as well, integrated across the country as a whole. We no longer have a single polity in this country. We have two quite separate and indeed not only different but divergent polities. And it is simply a matter of democratic health that we cannot go on with our smaller polity of 5 million, constantly in danger of being overpowered by a polity of 58 million. We must have an independent government, and that means a Scottish independent government and a yes vote on the 18th. My second reason for voting yes has to do with employing Scotland's resources for the benefit of Scotland itself. It's a huge topic. I mean, we could be talking about the renewables or the whisky industry or biotechnology, but let's just talk about oil and gas. Since North Sea oil was discovered, the oil and gas revenues have been frittered away by Westminster governments. In the 1970s, bad budgeting by the Labour Party, and in the 1980s, don't believe me, read Alan Clark's diaries, being used in order to sell off our utilities cheaply in a process of privatisation, which Alan Clark says could never have been carried through without the profits from the North Sea. Now, we used to know that we had 40 to 50 years of North Sea oil and gas left. That was last year's estimates. Before the new field opened off Aberdeen 2 months ago with 22 wells, not to mention the huge discovery to the east of Shetland at Bentley, which came in about 2 weeks ago. And I've been saying in my previous talks, my first 3 talks, that, well, there's also the Scottish Atlantic margin, and that's the Atlantic side, or the west coast, where we couldn't make exploration because of Trident. And I was saying there are decades more. Well, funnily enough, As you may see from some documents that I've left lying around the room, these two documents here, which I invite you to take away with you, we have discovered just this week that I, like the SNP in the 1970s, was woefully wrong. The SNP greatly underestimated the size of the North Sea in the 1970s, and I've been doing the same thing. It's not a few decades more, it's 100 years more, in two papers, one of which looks at the Scottish Atlantic margin and the West Coast, and the other one looks at unconventional oil and gas. That means in a marine environment, fracking in the North Sea on a particular ridge which crosses through Norwegian and Scottish waters. Our resources here are immense. There are only 2 oil-rich countries in the world that do not have a sovereign wealth oil fund. One is the pitiable state of Iraq. The other is Scotland. That is a scandal, and it must stop, and it will stop with a yes vote. My third reason for voting yes is that I wish to see an end to the expenditure of Scottish resources on vast projects from which we derive no immediate benefit whatsoever. Now, I could be talking about Crossrail, or the new London sewer system, or the money that Boris Johnson thinks is much better spent in Croydon than it is in Strathclyde, according to a recent speech. But let's just think about that high-speed train which may arrive in Leeds Station in 2030. It has no plans to come further north to Scotland, and that is going to cost us in Scotland £4.7 billion. But worse than that, far worse than that, is what was mentioned already by Paul, namely the renewal programme for the Trident missile system, which incidentally is also illegal under the Non-Proliferation Treaty as well. That is not only a ludicrous weapon, it has nothing to do with the situations that we face at the moment, particularly we've been aware of in this last week. It is an obscenely immoral weapon, and I speak as a Glaswegian. You may be surprised to hear me say that, but I actually am. I happen to be brought up by actors, that's why I sound like I do. I feel warmly about this. This is on the doorstep of my city, and it makes of my city and about 20% of the Scottish population the largest nuclear target in Western Europe. And that is a scandal too. And it must stop, and it will stop with a yes vote on the 18th. My last reason for voting yes is that I'm not a narrow nationalist. I'm an internationalist. I want a yes vote because I want to be sure that we remain a member of the European Union. They can't actually chuck us out. All of us in this room are European citizens. There's no way that can be taken away. The only country that has left the European Union, Greenland, after it became independent from the member state Denmark, and then it had to have a special referendum to decide in out, and then it took another 3 years after that before they could leave. That's what happens if you want to leave. With no intention of leaving. And furthermore, this is indeed, as Paul was saying, a dead issue. If you really want to inform yourself on what will happen in those 18 months of negotiation, read either of the articles. They are on the net by Professor Shona Douglas-Scott, an Edinburgh woman who is now the Professor of European Law at the University of Oxford, the author of the standard work on European Constitution, just gone into a new edition. Read her articles, and you will find out that what will happen is what is called the process of internal enlargement under Article 48 of the treaty. So scare stories, forget them. They're just nonsense. And you can look up that authority and you will see that that is how things will go. But of course, as a full member, we will have twice the number of MPs. We will have a minister on the Council of Ministers. We will have representation in the Commission itself. we will start to play something like our full part in the continent to whose culture we in Scotland have always belonged. And that is my final of my 4 reasons for voting yes. So, to become once again a proper democracy, to use our resources for our own good, to prevent the waste of our resources on projects from which we derive no benefit, and to take our proper place on the international stage. For all those reasons, I will be voting yes. But when we talk about resources, the biggest resource of all is the people of Scotland. It's you, it's me. A recent report on the comparative educated level of different countries simply concluded that Scotland is the most educated country in the whole of Europe, bar none, and the 3rd most educated country in the entire world. So this is no ordinary vote that we go to on the 18th of September. We go there bearing with us the most precious cargo of all, the future of all our futures. And it reminds me of the lines that Robert Bolt wrote in his play A Man for All Seasons, talking about Sir Thomas More reflecting on having sworn a great oath. And More says that it's like holding his life like water in his hands. If I do open my fingers then, I need not look to see my life again. That is what will happen with a no vote. But with a yes vote, we will not only preserve the health and well-being of our present and secure the future of all our futures, we'll do something else. You know, it's an extraordinary thing. The date of our referendum is the 70th anniversary, bar a single day, of the parachute drop at Arnhem. That generation who fought against Nazism also fought believing that they would build a better country. And that takes me to one of our greatest poets, William Souter, who in 1940, amidst the flares of the Blitz and the Battle of Britain, wrote a poem called Scotland. And he posed a question: have ye the Uncasicht that sees a tween and a tween? This world that lows in licht, yon world that hasna been. It's our late for fear, our early for this claim, when ye come hameless here, and ken ye are at hame. Have we got the insight to see that building the better home, the better Scotland, needs our yes vote on the 18th?
Thank you very much, Nigel, and thank you to all our speakers for a great first part of the evening. We'd like to have a maximum 15-minute break now for a cup of tea and a coffee, or just a refreshments, whatever. We can meet back at 9 o'clock, please, so we can get into the Q&A. Please, can I encourage you to fill them in if you can. Thank you. Okay. This is the part of the evening that I'm particularly keen on, because it's not about us up here. We know what we're doing in September. It's about you good people out there asking the questions, raising the issues that concern you, and hopefully going away this evening with at least some sort of answer, something that will allow you to make that informed decision on the 18th of September. So we've got a wonderful selection of questions tonight, a lot as well actually to get through. I don't think we'll get through all of them, but I'll certainly read them out. And those at the end that we don't manage, I'll certainly acknowledge them and read them out. I'd like to get started, if I may. We've tried to collate them into sort of specific areas, subject areas, and I would like to pick really what I think is a very pertinent one, and one that comes up again and again, and something that Paul alluded to. And this is regarding currency and pensions, and it's from John Hastings. And if I can maybe address this to Paul to start with, if I can. What currency will we have, and how will it be accepted? What will it cost the man in the street? I can leave it there. Thank you, Paul.
Okay. Here's the mic. I'm not sure where John is, but if you can make sure he hears me. Can you hear me okay? Well, John, as I said in the speech, it's the Scottish Government have done work with the Fiscal Commission Working Group, which involves a number of business figures, but two very eminent economists. As I say, Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who's an expert in monetary systems, and Sir James Mirrlees, who is a leading UK-based academic. And what they've done is they've looked at all the potential currency options that Scotland could use. They've narrowed it down to 5 that are viable, including, and I'll do them in groupings, 2 variants of using the pound. One where you've got a formal currency union, a partnership, if you like, between Scotland and the rest of the UK, whatever that is the hereafter called, to manage the currency jointly, to have a compact on what kind of average annual borrowing the government has, and its overall national debt, but otherwise you have freedom over fiscal policy, tax powers, and how you use them. The second option is to use the pound. It's often called sterlingisation, but it's used the pound anyway, because Margaret Thatcher abolished all currency controls on sterling when she was the Prime Minister. It's one of the pound is still one of the leading reserve currencies in the world. It's held by other number of governments around the world, other financial institutions, etc. About 9% of reserve currency deposits around the world are in sterling, and many governments use them. And it's important to say that, as I said in my speech, within the UK, obviously we use the pound, but also the Isle of Man, Jersey, Guernsey, and Gibraltar also use the pound sterling, and they're not part of the UK. So that's the other option, to basically use the pound anyway, because there's no. Well, it's called the Bank of England, but it's really the Bank of UK, the Bank of England. It is nationalised. It was nationalised in 1946. Scottish taxpayers, although we constitute only about 8.5% of the UK population, effectively have an 8.5% stake in that bank and everything it holds in terms of assets. So that's an alternative option. We can explain the implications of that in terms of debt, national debt, and other options. The other options that existed were to use the euro, which is a viable option, but it's one that we, as a Scottish Government, at least I can't speak for everyone in Yes, but the Scottish Government have dismissed that as an option for the moment because it's not the right time to be joining the Eurozone. And we have said if we ever did decide as an independent country to join the Euro, certainly the party I'm in, if we were the government, would call a referendum before we did that. So, but for the moment at least, it's not an option for us in terms of it's viable, but not necessarily an attractive one for us to go down. And the other option is to have your own currency. And there's 2 variants of that. One which you just allow the currency to float with the market, to find its own value, and don't intervene to make sure it stays stable with other currencies. Or you have one with your own currency and peg it to another currency. So it could be sterling, it could be the euro, it could be the dollar, whatever you choose. But you choose your interest rate to make sure the currency you have maintains its value relative to that other currency. So those are 5 options. Now, the Fiscal Commission Working Group concluded clearly that the one that was in the best interest of, they put it, both Scotland and independent Scotland and the rest of the UK, was to have that formal currency union, the partnership between the 2 governments, and to manage that currency in a managed way, and to make sure that you control your public expenditure so that the value of the currency isn't damaged over time. So that's the option that was found most attractive. We believe the UK government and the other opposition parties at UK level are posturing in this campaign. Professor Joseph Stiglitz warned us this would happen when he wrote the report. He said there's likely to be some posturing in the run-up to the referendum itself, but thereafter realpolitik, real economics kick in, and the currency, the sterling currency zone, it's fair to say the UK has a significant balance of trade problem at the moment, even with Scotland in it. Take Scotland out, which is an export-oriented country and makes a very positive contribution to the UK balance of payments, principally through oil and gas, but also whisky and other export products. That weakens the balance of trade even further, and there's a very strong relationship between having a balance of trade deficit and a devaluing currency over time. So effectively people are buying you're buying more goods in another currency than people are buying goods in your currency, and that means people are using other currencies more than yours, and therefore there's an exchange of value and the pound will fall in value. So by taking Scotland out, we weaken the pound further, and to add insult to injury from the pound's point of view, if the UK government forces us into a position where we have to say we're not going to have a formal currency union and not have the assets of the Bank of England, the use of its facilities, use of its staff, the use of the physical currency itself, etc., in terms of ownership of that, and particularly the gilts which the Bank of England have issued to the UK government, which the Bank of England holds. It's about 27%, I think, of the UK debt is actually held by the Bank of England itself, because it's something called quantitative easing. They've been issuing new money, sort of electronic money, to the UK government or through the recession. So if we're not allowed these assets, which they are technically assets, then we're not going to take the debt that goes with them. Somebody takes your car off you and suddenly you have to keep servicing the car loan. It's not an appropriate way to go. So we said in that situation we'd be in a situation where legally we wouldn't have any obligation to pay debt, but we are offering that to UK government as a price for allowing us to have this formal currency union. We will pay our share of the debt. And pensions, I don't know whether, do you want to deal with that, Nigel?
Well, yes, I mean, the pension situation is really extremely simple. We've had it from the pensions minister himself in the House of Commons, has made it quite clear that the UK will continue to pay the state pension. That's been said explicitly and not implied or anything, quite clear, explicit statement. And if you think about it, if you decided to retire to Spain, you'd have your pension paid. It's no different if you happen to be living in an independent Scotland. So there is no problem about pensions, and in terms of work-related pensions, I worked nearly all my life in England. My professional pension is in an English scheme. I don't have a problem with that. I will be paid that whether I'm living here or living in England. It doesn't make any difference.
Would anyone like to add anything to that? Anyone from the floor like to maybe pick up on that at all? Make any comments, observations? Okay, all right. I'll be happy to move on then, because we've got quite a lot to go through. One of the big things we're always asked about when we're out campaigning, we're obviously very conscious where we live. We're Scottish borders, 10-15 miles from England and Berwick, and we all dip into Berwick regularly, I'm sure, to work or to do our shopping, to whatever else. So it's one of the key things, one of the key questions that comes up again and again and again. And I've got a number of questions here with regard to sort of cross-border movement. I'll read them all out. They're all relating to cross-border movement, but some of them are a bit more specific than others. And Joan, if you don't mind maybe trying to pick up on some of these if you can. I've got a question from Annette Wilson here with regard to NHS cross-border movement. NHS dentistry. Half the patients in Berwick dental practice are from Scotland. Will they need to change over to Scotland? Again from Annette Wilson. I'm just picking, I'm not really going through them too much. Working over the border, living in England, how will this affect people working over the border? A recent question I was asked, which I think is a very pertinent question. I live in Scotland, I work in England, where do my taxis go? So that's something, again, we can maybe look at. No name on this one, but again about cross-border trade. It's more about trade barriers, actually. I may come back to that one if I may. And again, it's about cross-border movement from Zoe. Forgive me if I don't, is it Magnite? Or Zoe runs a small home business and posts her artwork through the UK. How will an independent Scotland affect postage? So, broad range of questions regarding cross-border movement, but specifically just some of the implications, some of the consequences perhaps of a yes vote in September. Maybe if you don't mind pick up on the tax thing, would that be okay, Joe? Thank you.
Well, as far as working in one country and living in another, plenty of people do that in Europe, and there doesn't seem to be any problem. As far as I understand it, and maybe Paul can see whether I'm getting it right here, but I understand you pay your tax where you live, not where you're employed. So that really shouldn't be too much of a problem for people working over the border and living here. The other ones, half the patients in Berwick dental practice are from Scotland. Well, I go to a dentist in Berwick, but I'm a private patient, so that wouldn't affect at all. I'm not sure how many NHS patients there would be in Berwick practices, but I don't think that would necessarily have to change at this point. if people choose to move back to Scotland dentist, then that would be their choice, as far as I can see. And the other one about postage, well, we post things all over the world. We post things to other countries, so I'm not sure that that would really affect anybody's business. I think you'd still be, I mean, obviously we would have a postal service, and it wouldn't actually affect somebody's ability to post things to somewhere in the rest of the UK, I wouldn't have thought.
Add a wee bit to that. I mean, one thing, again, it comes down to political choices, and Nigel was absolutely spot on. We're looking at the divergence between the two parliaments and the two societies. Obviously, the privatisation of the Royal Mail has been very much a UK government-led initiative, and Labour explored it when they were previously in office. The Conservatives are actually taking it forward with the Lib Dems in this current Parliament. And it's not to say that every party would necessarily sign up to this in independent Scotland, but there's certainly at least the prospect. It's one that we, in my own party, would like to do, but certainly one that we would be able to do legally, is to renationalise the Royal Mail in an independent Scotland and make sure we put the universal service and to put the universal service obligation, which is the thing that guarantees that regardless of where you are in Scotland, regardless of how rural your community is, you pay the same stamp as somebody who's living in another part of Scotland, an urban area. So that's a really important principle, and it would protect the cost of using postal services in a rural area like this. And I think it's Zoe McGuire, not Magnite, by the way. But that's I can maybe read the handwriting better than you. But I don't know Zoe personally. But yeah, just I'm used to my own bad handwriting, and that's a lot better writing than mine. But I was just going to say on the NHS issue, I mean, there's a lot of cross-border healthcare as it is, and Nigel's absolutely right. We have an independent NHS anyway. Operationally, it's completely independent of the rest of UK's NHS, or England's NHS. And what happens now is if you need a specialist or even a generalist healthcare that you use in England and you live in Scotland, there's a financial transaction takes place between the local NHS board in which you live and that service provider in England. So it's particularly important for things like transplants in Freeman Hospital in Newcastle, or Great Ormond Street Hospital in London for children's cancer specialists and those kind of things. And those services are provided, and the NHS in Scotland pays that hospital, if it's a hospital trust or an NHS provider, to provide that service for you. And that will continue, and actually the white paper says quite clearly there is no threat to cross-border activity. And we've even had Great Ormond Street Hospital were furious when the opposition to the No campaign tried to suggest that Great Ormond Street Hospital would stop treating patients from Scotland. They treat patients from Ireland, which is not in the UK, and many other countries across Europe, because it is a world centre for treating children's cancer and various other conditions. And that will continue. And they were very angry, and they put something on the record to say they would continue to provide those services to the people of Scotland post-independence. Also, the blood transfusion and transplant service have similarly said there is no reason why an independent Scotland will not continue to operate in the same way as it does now, cross-border, with providing blood when people in England need blood for a particular type, and vice versa, and obviously providing opportunities for transplants across border when there's a patient in England that needs an organ from Scotland, and vice versa. So these things will continue post-independence, and please don't believe the hype from the No campaign.
Thank you, Paul. I've got a question from a gentleman.
Just on the dentist one, I mean, Lermouth and Berwick probably have a big practice. That whole, there's about 5 of them, and they are the only NHS, or one of the few NHS dentists. So it is a big thing that people worry about. And one of the other worries, of course, is whether our bus from Chirnside will actually get into Berwick with a bus pass, or will we have to pay from the...
Yeah, well, I can just clarify that. I mean, at the moment, it's the Scottish Government pays for that bus pass already, and they have made 2 exceptions in terms of the terminus for a bus service. One is Berwick, one's Carlisle, so they're recognising the cross-border nature of the bus journeys to mainline rail stations. So that's likely to continue unless a future Scottish Government obviously changes that policy. But we have no plans to change that, and there's no reason why independence would force us to change that, because we're already subsidising that. It's the bus operator who gets the money. It's not the UK government. So it's it's an arrangement that could easily continue. And we do provide generalist, as I say. We talked about transplants and blood transfusions, these are very much specialist services, but general provision, things like maternity care and dentistry, those kind of services, there's no reason why in theory they cannot continue. Where there's a will, there's a way, and we're offering to the UK government, we will continue to fund these services in the same way, and unfortunately in the run-up to the referendum we've not had a reciprocal statement from the UK government to remove that doubt for people, but the Scottish government has made clear that we would continue to operate in the same way as we do now for these services.
Thank you, Paul. Nigel?
Just briefly on the health issue, I mean the simple principle is that the money follows the patient. So there really isn't a problem. I mean, I live a slightly complicated life. I live in Leithen, but I also live partly in Leeds. One bit of me gets looked after by a hospital in Leeds, and I'm not breaking sweat over it. I don't think it's a problem.
Is there anyone else like to add anything to that? I'm very conscious it's something that's very
alive and relevant to us where we live here in the borders. So, yes, sir.
Will the troops, the Scottish regiments that have been permanently stationed outside of Scotland, will they be repatriated back to the Scottish barracks where they should belong? For example, the Royal Scots, I think they're permanently based in Northern Ireland now. Would they come back to Scotland where they're meant to be? Well, an independent Scotland?
Well, obviously what we want to have is an independent Scottish Defence Force, and we're not saying we're going to force any member of the services to serve in the Scottish Defence Force. What we do want to offer is attractive terms and conditions for those soldiers, sailors and airmen to want to serve. At one point, Philip Hammond, the former Defence Secretary, is now Foreign Secretary in the UK government, tried to suggest that in the event of independence they would keep the regimental badges and they would stop us having our own regiments back. What a load of nonsense. They would have absolutely no control over defence in Scotland, an independent country. We can re-establish those regiments if we choose to do so, and the white paper says we will. But what we want to do is offer places to service personnel in the UK forces, whether they're from Scotland or elsewhere, because there are many nationalities in the UK Armed Forces, to serve in the Scottish Defence Force. And we've been quite realistic about the kind of numbers we could sustain initially, and we want to build up to the full strength forces after 10 years. So ultimately we'll end up with 10,000 regular forces and 5,000 reservists, both of which are an expansion in what's currently based in Scotland at present. So there'll be plenty of job opportunities for our personnel in the armed services. I know for a fact that in the 39th Regiment, which is an engineering regiment, it's just been located to Kinloss in Murray, when that airbase was shut and turned into an army base. This is the sort of payoff for the economic downturn in Murray. They put in an army regiment to try and make up the numbers. And the base commander there spoke to my colleague Richard Lockhead, who's the MSP for there, and said that since that happened, they've been inundated with requests from squaddies around the British Army wanting to be based back in Scotland for reasons of being close to family, their social ties, those kind of things. They don't want to be based in whether it's Belfast or Canterbury or Salisbury Plain. They want to be home, and an independent army, navy and air force will be permanently based in Scotland, but clearly there'll be opportunities for international service on peacekeeping or exercise in Canada, these sort of places, Norway. So they will get out and about, but they will have their permanent base in Scotland all of the time, which means when they're serving abroad, their loved ones who are still home are close to their families and they have the support network. So I think it's a really important difference between what you get in the current British Army. We have overstretch and people overseas a lot of the time when their loved ones are at home, feeling isolated and away from their families. And I think the rounded package we'll offer people will be very attractive to serving personnel to join our forces.
Having trained in the military myself, mainly with Scottish regiments in my younger days, and, I think if you just asked any of the Scottish regiment soldiers, they'd walk back anyway. They'd come back, without permission. I think that's what everybody I speak to now, previous military friends from the Scottish regiments. They all would rather be based in Scotland because they're Scottish troops.
Yeah, I mean, I great regret. I mean, obviously, war is a necessary evil. Sometimes you don't want to have an army or navy or an air force. But the first role of a country is to defend its citizens. But I remember when I was at primary 7 at school, I did a project a history project on the Scottish division, infantry division we had at that stage. There were 8 regiments in it, full strength battalions each, so about 800 men each. So that gives you a sense of scale. We now, so over 6,000 personnel. We now have 2,300 in the Royal Regiment of Scotland. All of those regiments, historic regiments that had a regional footprint like the Royal Scots, the Kingsland Scottish Borders, which my relatives served in, have disappeared, and they're just used for ceremonial purposes. You've got the Lowland regiments now wearing kilts when they always wear trews. Lots of different things have changed, and we have the opportunity with independence to bring back those traditions, which were very attractive for people in terms of recruitment. People liked going into the regiment. Their grandfather, their father served in, and had a regimental connection to their area.
There was talk a few years ago of building a big army base in the borders of Scotland. Anything to add to that, or is it still going ahead? Was it an English thing or a Scottish idea?
My understanding was that was just an idea which was put in as a bit of a sop at the time the regiments were being cut back, to say that there would be some, it was going to be a mechanised unit training area that was going to be probably between Lauder and Charter Hall, and it has died a death, I think, as an idea. But we would see an expansion of military personnel in Scotland and the civilian jobs that are associated with it, because we're paying for a lot of jobs to be located in Whitehall that could be easily located in Scotland and would be located in Scotland, creating new employment opportunities for people. But our main base will be at Faslane, joint services base will be at Faslane, but we've obviously got barracks around Scotland that would house the army.
Okay, if you don't mind, I'd like to move on a little bit further. Thank you for your contribution. Just before we move away from the the cross-border issue, I'm conscious again that that's a very important, pertinent issue for us all here. Is there anything else that anyone would like to raise on the particular aspect of cross-border movement, whether it be trade, pensions, where you pay your tax? Yes, you mind speaking into the mic? Would that be okay?
Well, living in Paxton, we got all our posts from Berwick, so it's like from England. Where will that come from after independence?
Well, there is an issue, as you probably know as well, in that area with the postcode itself, which has been a long-standing historic issue, fooled in other places which are hampered by this, that you pay higher insurance premiums and all sorts because you're associated with Berwick rather than being in Scotland. So there might be an argument for changing the postcode and having a different delivery centre, but you could, if an agreement could be reached where there's a continued role for the sorting office in Berwick, then it could be relocated. It'll have to be additional resources into Eyemouth or somewhere, or Duns, to be able to continue to deliver to the area. But these are issues that are practicalities that you would have a common sense discussion, and obviously there are public sector workers, like, well, I suppose they're now privatised, so it's maybe not quite as applicable, but you still have a duty to look after the welfare of the people that are working in those jobs and make sure there's a fair outcome for them in terms of treatment. But presumably, if it came to it, they could be offered jobs in the sorting office in Eyemouth rather than rather than have them being made redundant. Yes, hopefully it would kill two birds with one stone. You could get the insurance premiums sorted out and various other things. I know couriers charge more sometimes for deliveries to areas simply because there's a different postcode from the rest of Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else before we move on from the particular issues like cross-border dynamics we have? You okay? Brilliant. Well, thank you for your contribution. I appreciate that. Maybe Nigel, if you'd like to pick up on this, specifically regarding the oil and oil and gas and reserves, and I've got a couple of questions on that. One from James Lockie and the other one from Kyle Patterson. I'll read James out first if I may. And James says he's a little confused. The No campaign has stated, and obviously paraphrasing Serene Wood's recent statement, that gas and oil will run out in approximately 16 years. However, two professional engineers have stated, picking up on an article in the Scotsman, 22nd of August, that enhanced engineering techniques and recovery techniques will allow a significant amount of more oil to be retrieved potentially for the next 50 to 100 years. So any comments on that? And the second one again is from Kyle Patterson, Oil and Employment. With the promise of centuries-long oil bonanza, will the jobs that are created for Scotland be kept in Scotland? So two questions specifically around the sort of North Sea and recent finds.
Right. Okay. Right. First of all, the funny figures one. Yeah, Ian Wood is, of course, a big name in the oil business, and people have been very interested in what he said, but he said various things at various times. It depends which edition of Ian Wood you want to listen to. His interview on television in February was 25 billion barrels. He has suddenly readjusted that down to 16. He's also been on record at 24, and I believe on one occasion 21. So you toss your Ian Woods in the air and pick the one you fancy. The point is, we're talking about, to be serious, we're talking about a huge amount of oil or a mega huge amount of oil. None of those figures is bad news. They're all very good news. And the most recent discoveries, which or suggested future possibilities, which I circulated those papers on, of course, go far, far beyond that. And a word too about the value of the oil. You will have heard figures put around from the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OBR. Now, the OBR figures, which the Westminster government have been going on about as blowing a hole in the White Paper's case about the value of oil, are based on a trajectory for oil prices which is unique. There are 5 different indices of projected future oil prices that are made use of. 2 come from the government. One is the OBR, and the other is the Department for Environment and Climate Change, DECC. And there are 3 industry indices. Out of those 5 indices, the only one which has got a downward trajectory is the OBR. And it is projecting oil prices falling to $90 a barrel and less. All the others are on an upward trajectory, going from what has been the historic average over the last 10 years of about $108 a barrel to over $135 a barrel. So the OBR one is the odd man out. Next point. Irrespective of what the price level of oil is in any given year, it does fluctuate, of course it does, the value of North Sea oil and gas, or our Scottish oil and gas, is worth 11 times more to each of us in an independent Scotland than it is if we remain part of the UK. It's a simple sum. It's a population calculation. You can do it yourself on the back of an envelope. There is an enormous, overwhelming advantage in us being independent in terms of the share of whatever revenues come from our oil and gas. The last point, I am haunted by a personal experience of my own. Way back in the early 70s, when it was all just beginning to break the news about North Sea oil and gas, I and a group of my friends from different universities around the UK, not just Scotland, from UCL in London, even from UCD in Dublin, and from Glasgow and Edinburgh and so on, gathered at my home in Edinburgh. We were young graduates and postgraduates, and we were concerned that with oil, it should not happen as had happened with a big mining discovery in Ireland run by a Canadian firm, which had resulted in a lot of allegations of corruption and the Irish government not getting out of it what they should. We were concerned that this should not happen with oil and gas. Well, I'm afraid we muffed it. We were young, we were at start of careers that took us off in different parts of the world. There wasn't the internet, there weren't the means of keeping things together that we have now, and our attempt to set up what we call the Scottish Resources Group because it was about Scottish resources, but we were not nationalists. We were not particularly concerned about preserving it for Scotland. We were actually thinking about preserving it for the UK. In our wildest dreams, we could not have imagined how badly the UK handled it. And what we had in mind was, in fact, the way that Norway went, with a Statoil that really built up a national holding and national wealth. And I'm haunted by that memory. I don't want to see what we muffed up all those years ago being muffed up again.
Thank you, Nigel. Sorry, sir, would you like to add anything to that?
Thank you. Yeah, Nigel, just on that last point, if there's exploration, the untapped resources at the moment, is it possible that it won't just be tax revenue that you would be able to get from a future fund, but actually you'd be able to say to BP or whoever, you're not getting as big a slice of the pie, actually it's going to come to the government?
I very much hope so. I do hope that this time we'll get something more like the Norwegian way of going about things, with increasing pressure, at least, put on oil companies as the years progress in exploration, that they have to pay some sort of premium, or as indeed happened with a lot of the early exploration in Norway, where the Norwegians made conditions on the licenses for payment into Norwegian infrastructure. You can have a license, but we've got to have a proper road and a proper settlement built in connection with it. And the Norwegians got schools and roads and public housing and all sorts of things out of that. It meant also that they developed the field more slowly, which means, of course, that they have kept their resources much better and are much better to go on profiting from it over the long term. But perhaps you ought to ask the Minister.
I would just, I can't really do any better than Nigel on this, other than to say that I think stewardship is a really important part of it. When you look, the Norwegians obviously established their sovereign wealth fund in 1990, but for the first 6 years they didn't put any funding into it because they were kind of set-up costs, but since then it's now reached £502 billion worth. So a country of 4.9 million people have a rainy day fund of £500 billion to draw on. And as Nigel said earlier on in his speech, it's absurd and offensive that Scotland has reached a position where we've got no lasting financial legacy from conversion of this underground asset into a financial asset above ground. We've not, Joseph Stiglitz is very, very strong on this issue, and has been on television condemning the UK government's approach that they should have and establish an oil fund at the same time as Norwegians, or earlier even. And we would have a massive resource to fund the kind of infrastructure we need for the 21st century today. We wouldn't be arguing over how much we can afford to put in broadband. It would just be done. We would have new roads, rail, the kind of rail that we need to get around Scotland. It would be done without a blink of an eye. And I think they draw a maximum of 4% of that fund each year from Norway. They set themselves a limit to preserve the value of the fund for future generations, which is a very marked difference in attitude towards stewarding natural resources to what we have in the UK, where it's exploit everything while you can, whereas the Norwegians think about the future, and well, obviously it's a high carbon type of fuel. They're making sure they invest the funds from that into accelerating low carbon in the rest of their economy. So you can actually use that financial windfall to accelerate your transition away from fossil fuels too. So it can actually be good for the environment in the longer term as well. So they just, I have huge admiration for the way the Norwegians run their society, as the other Scandinavian countries do, and we could learn a lot from them.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add anything on that particular subject area? Okay, I'd like to move on. I'm kind of conscious of time's running on with. I've got lots of questions to go through, but I'm not going to be able to get through all of them. But maybe just pick a couple more. One that we come across quite a lot, it's quite an emotive one actually for some people, and it's with regard to the monarchy. And obviously we've just had the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, which I think were highly successful no matter which way you want to look at it. It's just a question from Anne, and perhaps Joan would like to pick up on this one, specifically regarding the monarchy. How can Scotland keep the monarchy whilst being an independent country?
Okay. Now, I'm not sure if everybody knows the background to the monarchy. I went to school in Coburnspath, and there the market cross there has the rose and the thistle on the various sides of it, and that was to commemorate the marriage of Margaret Tudor to James IV of Scotland. Their great-grandson, James VI of Scotland, then inherited the throne when the Tudor line died out with Elizabeth I of England. So, on accession to the throne in 1603 of England, and of course he still was monarch in Scotland, you had the Union of the Crowns, and that's a different union from the political union of 1707. So there is no reason we cannot keep the monarch, if we choose to, as our head of state. After all, the Commonwealth countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, there's maybe some more, I'm not quite sure, also have the Queen as their head of state. Did I mention Australia? Yeah, that must be one of them. They also keep the Queen as their head of state. So there's absolutely no reason that Scotland couldn't keep the monarch as a head of state as well. Unless, of course, we want to decide to become a republic at some later date, which again would need probably a referendum. So there's not a problem with that.
Just very briefly comment. I think Joan's absolutely right at that point. I mean, it's a distinguish between what you have on day one and what you can do as a society later on. I mean, it's possible there could be a referendum at UK level at some point on the monarchy and creating a republic. So I understand there's some people who don't like the fact that they would potentially retain the monarchy post the referendum, but that's a day one position. It gives people certainty about what we start off life with as an independent country, and there are plenty of governments around the world that obviously have the Queen as a head of state to deal with. I can't remember the precise number, but I think it's more than 10 anyway. Certainly the Queen is still a member of state, so they're the head of state rather. So it's a day one position versus what people who believe in a republic can obviously campaign for that in an independent country and make the case for a referendum. Parties can come forward and stand an election on that platform, and if it's a popular cause, they will gain seats in the Parliament and be able to push that agenda. But it's just a day one position versus a long term position that potentially could be pursued.
Thank you.
Just to demonstrate that Yes has got many different viewpoints, I'm a little bit less bothered about us keeping the monarchy, because at least, thank God, we won't have the House of Lords. But speaking entirely personally, I must say I would like to see us having a situation without the monarchy. If we're going to have the monarch, then at least I'd like our next monarch to go through a proper Scottish coronation with the honours of Scotland and the Stone of Destiny. In longer term, as Paul rightly says, this is day one, we have the monarchy. Longer term, I'd like to see a constitution that didn't have the monarch, and I'd like to see not a president, I'd like to revive the ancient title of Guardian of the Realm, which Wallace once had.
I was just going to add, in terms of the written constitution, it's an important point that people know about anything about the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320. It was the first document anywhere in the world that enshrined the principle of popular sovereignty, which means that the sovereignty of the people, literally. And in essence, it said that the monarch of the day, in this case Robert the Bruce, was monarch for as long as he satisfied the objectives that were set by the people of Scotland. And if he failed, or she failed, to deliver, then the monarchy would be changed. So it was the first document that said the people have sovereignty over the monarch in a sense, and can choose the head of state. And the written constitution that we are proposing in independent Scotland, which will be democratically developed and not a plaything of the government, it will be done independently of government, whichever government that is, will be done in such a way as these principles could be enshrined in the written constitution, and could therefore mean that we may be happy with the monarch for the moment, but as long as they deliver for the people of Scotland, and if they don't, then look out.
Thank you. I think I'll need to make this a last question, actually. I do apologise, but, you know, time is moving on, and perhaps it's probably one of the more important questions of the evening, because it's one of the narratives we're hearing about the opportunities in independent Scotland for perhaps a more fair and more equal society. Certainly it's an aspiration that I think the majority of us would like to work towards. So these questions are very much around that area, if I may. And Joan, would you be happy to pick up to start with? I've got several. I'll read out the questions, but I've got a question from Beatrice Lockie again about the Barnett formula and the potential scrapping of that. There's a question from Zoe about benefits and how an independent Scotland might be able to negate the bedroom tax and the disability benefits. But a couple from Kate Duncan, actually, maybe just sort of home in on them, if I may, because it's certainly very pertinent at the moment, and it's again regarding the redistribution of wealth and fairness, but specifically regarding some of you may be aware that we're currently negotiating a transatlantic treaty, free trade treaty with America. And this will have major implications for us going forward. And so perhaps I could just pick up on this one, Joan, if you're okay with it. Yeah. What's the attitude of Yes to the trade treaty? I'm concerned that a new Scotland may be more. I'm concerned that a new Scottish government would be more accountable, could be potentially compromised if we sign up to the TTIP.
As far as I understand it, the TTIP, where it could affect the NHS, should not actually, at the moment, affect Scotland because it's a public service. It's not in any way been privatised. So that should not actually affect us at the moment. But where it can affect us is that the amount of funding for the English NHS, if that goes down, that would then affect us through the Barnett formula. And I'll hand you over to Nigel because he wants to say something.
If I can just a little corrective to that. The problem with TTIP in relation to the NHS is that the Westminster government has had the opportunity in the negotiations to make a case for the NHS to be excluded from the terms of TTIP. These are terms which require the signatories to allow commercial competition across their economy and therefore in public services. And the Westminster government, Mr Cameron, has refused to make that case for the NHS to be an exception. And the result would be that if we were to vote no and remain a part of the UK, it would mean that the Scottish NHS could be under direct, not just vague, but direct pressure to have to offer health contracts to American private health companies. And indeed the government could be sued through a very, very unsatisfactory legal process, an arbitration process in which there is no appeal and which has been used quite cripplingly against some public health regulations in Australia already. It could be sued for attempting to refuse these private health companies access to the Scottish NHS. It is therefore absolutely vital, if you want the NHS in Scotland to remain a proper public service, that you vote yes, because then we would be a separate country and we would not be bound as a region of the UK to be vulnerable to the terms of TTIP.
I'll just add, I mean, I do share Nigel's concern about this, and you know, there are governments in Europe that are already taking steps to exempt whole areas of their public services from this. So you know, we can see that legally it's possible to exempt your NHS or other key services from the influence of TTIP, and obviously in an independent country we could do that, whereas we, as Nigel says, we're bound in by the UK at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Would anyone like to add anything to that before we finish up. I think that's a very relevant thing at the moment. If you don't know much about it, I would suggest that you have a look about it. It's happening now as we speak. I'm really conscious of time. I'd love to go on, but we've all got homes and beds to go to. We've had a couple of hours of hopefully decent debate and some good question and answer as well. I'll just run very quickly through the other questions that we have. I think it's only right and proper. We had a question from Chris with regard to sort of Project Fear. And have we missed an opportunity? Some no voters are saying not yet in terms of independence, but maybe one day. What else can we do to get across that the no team actually mean no, not ever, never again? So that's Chris. Thank you, Chris. Again, Chris again. I just picked him up in any order. This would do with Alex Armand. You know, Mr. Marmite himself. Is Alec both our biggest asset and our biggest liability? How can we change that? And there was a couple of questions on the currency again from Margaret Campbell. I've got all my personal money in an English bank. Should I move it? Should I move it now? If not, why not? And we've covered some of the defence questions as well. So that's all the questions for this evening. I'd just like to sort of finish really, just to wind things up, if I may, by thanking our panel of guests for being here this evening. I've got Joan Campbell, Paul Wheelhouse and Nigel Mace. I'd like to show appreciation. Thank you very much. I'd also, if I may just take 1 minute, maybe just to thank the team that we have got in Yes Berwickshire. I won't mention them by name because it won't be here too long. There's many of us, but we've been together now for the last 14, 15 months. It's been wonderful. I wouldn't swap it for the world. This is when I get a wee bit emotional with these things, but it's been a great journey. This will never happen again, folks. It's been a pleasure knowing you all. You're sort of true friends of mine now. Hopefully we all are going forward. But more importantly, it's about you guys out there. You've come along tonight. You've at least, you know, if I may, you've made an effort to come out on a Friday night to listen to us, to take the information away, and hopefully make that informed decision come the 18th of September. If I may just finish up in one little point, and Paul's mentioned it already, and it goes back to Jim Sellers. To me, this is the most powerful statement that I've heard, you know, through this campaign. If I can just paraphrase what Jim Sellers said, that you know, on the 18th of September, for 15 hours on the 18th of September, sovereignty's back with you guys. We're going to hold it in our hands for those 15 hours. At 1 minute past 10, Scotland will have decided whether to keep that or to hand it back to someone else. So that's what we need to think about. So listen, thank you very much. Joy.